when a company goes for free and you go to their comment section on their Facebook page or Instagram and you just see hundreds of thank yous, I mean, that's not something they get every day.
This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. I was thrilled last week to talk to PJ Smith for this week's episode. PJ is the Director of Fashion Policy at the Humane Society of the United States, and he's played a major role in getting big brands like Armani to drop fur and institute corporate-wide fur-free policies. We had a wonderful conversation about fur policy, the historic context of the current fight to make fur history, and how his method has proven successful. We even got into self-care and what solutions exist for every advocate who wants to see an end to the use of fur in fashion. Now we've got a few quick things to discuss before we get into that. First, let's check out a review. This one from Must Be Jam on iTunes. Michael's podcast is a champion for animals. As an animal lover and vegan, this subject is close to my heart. It's a subject that is timely and important for the conservation of wildlife and the ecosystems of our natural world. I live next door to Yosemite National Park and know how advocacy is an important part of conservation and protecting our wildlife. Thank you, Michael. Well, thank you, Must Be Jam. That was great, and I love your name. Reviews and ratings really help boost Defender Radio's visibility. For instance, we were in the top 25 for the nonprofit sector when I announced our 100,000th download, and a whole bunch of you checked it out. So whether it's on iTunes, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts, or even just the Defender Radio Facebook page, please do take a moment and write a review. And I might just read yours during an upcoming episode. I also wanted to thank two recent Patreon supporters of the show, Tara and Danielle. Thank you both for your monthly support. It takes the burden of covering costs of the show from the Fur Bears and creates new opportunities for things like transcripts and other projects, including a brand new project that I'm going to tell you about right after you hear from PJ. So, with no further delays, here's PJ Smith of HSUS discussing fur, fashion, and the future. A logical place to start in this broad conversation we're going to have is the question with, are people wearing fur? Because this, and I don't know if you get this, probably not so much down in Texas, but in the northern states, every winter we hear people say, oh, all I see is Canada Goose or fur trim everywhere. But is it everywhere, I guess? Do we know how many people are wearing fur in North America, what the trend is right now? Where are we at with fur?
It's a good question, and it changes quite often. I mean, you'd be shocked to know you say Texas, but Dallas, Texas is one of the top fur sales cities in the United States, which gives you a pretty good indication that it's not about keeping you warm.
Yeah.
It's about a certain status symbol. And so where we are, I guess, globally is still there's quite a lot of production and a lot of sales happening in China and Russia, depending on how their economy is doing. But the more you go west to Europe and the United States, I think the trend right now is away from fur. I think it's a couple things are happening. I think where consumers' attitudes towards animals are changing, generally in all industries, from cosmetic testing to the animals that for fruit and food production. And right now we're seeing brands that want to capitalize on that growing market, generally with like Gen Z. Up from there, millennials, I think that's not where the change is happening. Definitely not in my generation, Gen X, but it's the Gen Z that all these companies are just salivating over. I think they see them as the future luxury consumers, the bigger than the baby boomers, and that's the target. So they recognize that generation really cares about these issues. And by posting on social media and making these very loud fur-free announcements, it's really going, it's spreading. And they're getting all this free advertising on social media. And what then is happening is now the legislative side is following the corporate side. And what we're seeing is in Europe, fur production is moving away. So when, say, the Netherlands passed its fur production ban, we started seeing fur farms kind of leave the Netherlands and go to other countries like Poland and Europe. But now Poland's like, well, we don't want that industry here. And so they're looking at banning it. And so right now it's like Europe is very focused on banning fur production. And here in the US, this is just something that kind of blows my mind, is that starting with West Hollywood in 2013, we're banning fur sales. Then Berkeley, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And right now we're at a point where California is currently looking to ban. They introduced a bill to ban fur sales. And New York and New York City have introduced bills to ban fur sales. And we should have votes on both of those very soon. It kind of blows my mind. I mean, in the United States, like, New York City is fashion.
Yeah.
So you have potentially the fashion capital, one of the fashion capitals of the world, looking to ban fur sales, to say it's so cruel that they don't want anything to do with it, and that there's alternatives that are just as good. And so that's what's happening. And I think that's really going to just change the conversation completely when you have these cities starting to ban fur sales. I know it's getting some companies like Canada Goose, very nervous, because I don't know if you know much about the bull hook. If you know what a bull hook is, it's this stick with a hook at the end. And it was used to train circus elephants, kind of to break them down, and you place the hook right behind their ear, and it's very sensitive. And when an elephant sees a trainer with a bull hook, they pretty much do whatever that trainer wants. And so what activists around the United States started doing were they worked with their city councils to ban this bull hook so that circuses couldn't bring that in. So what ended up happening was the circus couldn't come to Los Angeles, couldn't come to certain cities in, I think New Jersey was one of them. And it became too much of a scheduling nightmare for circuses like Ringling, Barnum and Bailey to figure out, okay, well, we can go to this city, but we can't go to this city, and we don't know how we'll get the elephants from here to here. And so they ended up closing after 150 years because of these little city ordinances. And I think what's going to happen now is, depending on what happens in New York City and California, I already know there's about 3 or 4 other cities that are looking to introduce fur sales bans in the United States. But I think it's going to be really, really difficult for these brands to say, oh, I can't sell our product in this store, but we can sell it across the street in this city. And they're just going to want to avoid that complication altogether. And I think that's where Canada Goose is pretty nervous. And you're going to start seeing Canada Goose come out with other products that are probably just as warm and fashionable as some of that coyote fur, but without the cruelty. And so I think that's where you're going to see huge change happening. And with these companies going for free, I know that China's consumers really care about brand recognition. They want their logos big on on their bags. And so when they're making these announcements, when you have Gucci going for free and Versace, all these huge luxury brands now saying they want nothing to do with it, I think that really resonates with the Chinese consumer as well. So I'm very optimistic right now.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot there to talk about, and we'll get through as much of it as we can. And one of the things I got to think that is making such a huge difference is very simply social media. You touched on that with some of the Gen Z or Gen Z, depending on where you are, that threw me off. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know.
Oh yeah, we say that's one of our Canadianisms. We've got like half our language is British English and half our language is American English.
Got it.
So we have U's randomly in a lot of words, and we say Z instead of Z. Anyway, it's a whole thing. So it was very confusing as a child with all that American media we were talking about. I think with social media, though, definitely we're having that impact, and we're seeing it's all of a sudden all of this information is so much more accessible. And I wanted to chat a little bit about sort of the last big, what I would call animal rights movement. And I guess it was that late 80s, early 90s when fur was at its height then. And people look back and say, well, what happened? And you hear a lot of people talk about on the street activism, which no doubt played a role. But I gotta wonder if the reason it came back is because we didn't have social media, because we couldn't say, here's what a fur farm looks like, here's what a trapped animal looks like so easily like we can now.
Sure. I think that's a really, really wonderful point. You're 100% right that fashion in itself is cyclical. So when something goes away, it generally comes back. I mean, there's some trends that I would hope would never come back, but it's surprising to see some kids walking around. I can't wait for the like big oversized jeans and overalls and bell bottoms coming back
with the wooden beaded necklaces and
exactly.
Oh, great.
But what happened, so you're right, like the activism in the late 80s, early 90s, mostly with like PETA in the United States doing these provocative billboards and ad campaigns. Same was kind of happening over in the UK with Farm Aid. And it was, the sales went down, imports went down. It was taboo to wear fur. That's where the kind of the myth of throwing red paint came about. But if you look back at that time, not only was there no social media to really spread the word, but there was no, I think activists were kind of new at it and they didn't get corporate policies.
Oh, yeah.
And the only thing out of the 80s and 90s that happened, besides just this understanding that wearing fur was bad, was that Calvin Klein went fur free. That's it. So it's not shocking to me that it came back, and it came back strong in the mid 2000s. And now we're seeing that the importance of getting these corporate public policies, so that even like when we work with companies, Humane Society of the United States, we won't stop unless they say like we're going to make a public policy. Because any sort of, we were working with companies earlier that was saying like, well, we don't want to alienate our consumers, so we're going to kind of just keep it internal. I'm like, nope, you need to say something. You need to put it on your website. I need to point to it. And the importance of that is the bandwagon effect that has happened since then. When you get a Gucci to finally say that you're going for free, you're going to see all these companies just, the dominoes are falling at this point, and social media is helping with that. And you're right too, where some of these videos that people can see. I mean, I don't know about, maybe it's just that I'm working in animal welfare, but I can't go on social media without seeing 20 dog videos, 10 cat videos, and I don't know anything else, but that I think that's really resonating with people too, where we're learning about animals. I watched a video of a crow bending a tool to get something out of a tube the other day, and I was like, oh shit. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, you can swear, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. And that crows are super, super smart, and we are now learning about that. We are seeing baby elephants get trapped in holes and their mothers coming rushing to protect them. There's just this overall great understanding of animals, and how that they each are individuals, and we might not want to hurt them, and see them either skinned or their horns for ivory or their skins for a fur coat and a trim that's really unnecessary at this point, because there's alternatives that are just better. So yeah, you're right. And there's a lot of things going on there, but I am again confident that these public policies are going to make it extremely difficult for fur to ever come back as an acceptable trend.
And that makes perfect sense, because you can point and say, well, you've got this policy. And we came up against that. I think it was, I can't remember the name of the actual parent company, but it's the folks who own Canadian Tire and Sport Check and, excuse me, a couple of Quebec-based sporting goods stores. And they quietly said, we're going to go for free, but it wasn't so much they were going for free, it's that they weren't selling any fur products that season. Mm-hmm. And trying to balance this as saying this is great, it shows that consumer choice is working, but also recognizing this isn't a forever thing necessarily, for exactly the reason you've just said, that they didn't say, yes, we are fur free and this is why, and our policy moving forward. And sure enough, I think it was 1 or 2 seasons later, they started introducing fur products again. Mm-hmm. And I think that really does point to the importance of understanding the structure that we're dealing with, the corporate structure, the social structure, and all those underlying things. And I guess I don't know how to phrase this, but in your experience, is it a black and white situation where you go in and you say, this is bad and you have to change? Or is there some level of recognizing that this is a huge systemic situation that we can't change just by saying, I want to see a change? And I don't mean to be dismissive of your work. I don't mean to be dismissive of the people in the streets, but just trying to put that context into it of it's not a binary kind of situation when you approach it.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I mean, when I first started this job, and I've been working on fur for the Humane Society of the United States for about 10 years. And at the beginning, it was about getting meetings. And I remember I got a meeting with this big retailer out in New York City, big luxury retailer. And they brought all the heads of the different departments. And I was like, okay, I'm never going to have this opportunity again. And I'm going to show them the worst of the worst, the caracal fur from Uzbekistan of preborn lambs and skinning alive and all the things that are part of the fur trade. And I remember seeing their faces, and they just shut down. They didn't want anything to do with it. And they were like, they said, thank you for showing us that. Like, but that's where the conversation ended. And I realized then that this wasn't just let me show you the bad parts and you're going to suddenly change. And so my approach has drastically changed in the last few years, where now I go into companies and I say, okay, this is what's happening. And they say, we want to find the most humane source of fur out there. And I say, okay, let's find it. And we'll go through everything. We'll go through every marketing scheme. We'll go through every country's production. Mm-hmm. Even some of the brands, they'll go to the fur farms. And every single time that they start that discussion, they have gone fur free. And I think it's not just because, I mean, I think the bottom line is dollars. And right now consumers are, that changing attitude you mentioned before, are leading to dollars on social media. But I also think that this whole idea of doing good is making companies do better financially as well. So I think that they want to do the best that they can within the parameters, and so they do their homework. But the thing about the fur trade, different from wool and leather and down and a lot of these other products, which don't dismiss it. They're just as cruel and a huge risk of being associated with animal cruelty. But fur is one of those things that's just a wild animal in a cage. You can't really find a good way to do that. And that's where a lot of these policies are happening. And same with trapping. I mean, it's just some of these brands, when they see trapping, they're like, well, we want nothing to do with that. And so they're like, okay, what species is that? And so then you have to kind of go through, okay, well, this isn't just one policy that can fix it all. A lot of times with Gucci, we went through every species out there, starting with seal. And so it took a long time. I mean, that conversation was happening the entire time that I've been at the Humane Society, so 10 years. and just now are we getting to somewhere. So that answer your question?
Yes, because I didn't really ask a great question. So you gave me a wonderful answer to a non-question. Sometimes it's hard, you know. You talk about journalism and interview skills and everything. You say, oh, well, a beautifully crafted question, and you spend time rolling it around in your head and writing down versions of it, and then eventually you sometimes just have to be like, here's some information. Can you please respond to it? And that works. But in all honesty, that part of it is you are the expert on this. I'm not. So let's set you up to talk about it. So it is impressive when we look at the list. So I've got the humanesociety.org site open, HSUS, for the 2018 annual report. And the list of clothing manufacturers, retailers, and designers who joined our call to drop fur from their lines grew dramatically in 2018. Includes Columbia Sportswear Company, fur-free announcements from Coach, Burberry, Donna Karan, DKNY, Versace, Furla. But I'm insulting entire cultures here by my pronunciations. I'm sorry.
I can tell you that when I started working this, I would look up how to say some of these brands on the internet. Like right before I would be going in and meeting with them, I'd be like, okay, how do you say that? Balenciaga. And then there was this, I found, sorry to go off on a little tangent, but I found like that there was this website that was trying to spoof people on it by showing them how to mispronounce it. So you really had no idea if it was, I think Justin Bieber was the first one I realized that it was like Justin Bieber, and it said Justine Bieberholben. I was like, oh no, I've got to double check before I go into some of these meetings. But yeah, it's really just taken off. I mean, if you look at it like in a timeline, it's going up, and it's going up very quickly to the point where we could potentially be running out of some of these really well-known global brands. And that's where we have the biggest strength through the Fur Free Alliance, who Fur Bear Defenders is part of, as well as the Humane Society of the United States. So it's 50 animal protection organizations from like 25 countries around the world that all are working to end the fur trade. And that's where I think it's really scary to some of these brands to see the strength, the global strength of an organization like that. And we're getting to the point where there aren't that many left, and there's plenty to go. But we are potentially working our way out of a job, out of an industry, and it's already rearing its head. What's next? And I've seen some of these brands that have gone fur free like 10 years ago are now focusing on exotic skins. And it's a whole other conversation. It's a whole other supply chain. And you got to appreciate the complexity of some of these supply chains. And I think that's what companies really resonates with them, that you're trying to understand this stuff with them, because it's so difficult to have transparency from a hut in Malaysia that's killing pythons to a purse in New York City. And so once you do start diving into that and seeing the illegal trade that's part of it and the cruelty, there's just no standards. And that's where you're now seeing companies take that additional step, like Chanel. When they went for free, they banned exotic skins too. So it's also this competitive race between brands of who's going to be the most humane. And that's what we're seeing with these cities going for free as well. Is LA is like, we're the most humane city in the world. And now New York City is going to say, we're the most humane city in the world. So there's this race of compassion that it's like, I guess it's quite beautiful if done for the right reasons. But that's this kind of this systematic issue it's happening because of these changing attitudes, be it social media, be it just general awareness.
One of the things I don't know, and you can tell me, in the U.S., in Canada, the fur trade, particularly trapping, is very romanticized. And today we're not going to get into the subject of colonization and colonialism and all of the associated things. Those are important, and play a role in where we're at now. But that is a very sensitive, particular subject. So I'm not going to force you into that conversation. Regardless, it is very romanticized, and governments are constantly, at the very least, I'd say, our centrist to right-leaning government officials are often praising trappers. They're often creating legislation. Like, we have a day to celebrate trapping heritage. It's an unofficial holiday, but it was recognized in the House of Commons. And whenever there are conversations about this, whenever, we send in thousands upon thousands of signatures on a petition about killing neck snares because of the dogs dying, we get back a form letter about, oh, well, trapping is a traditional way of life in Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have that kind of vote pandering in regards to trapping and fur farming in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think it's generally in the same boat as hunting, but not as much. But you'll see kind of hunters defend trappers and the other way around. That hasn't really stopped the decline of the industry. I think you're right. There's this idea of traditional wanting to go out there and trap, but right now it's just economically doesn't make sense for them. They can't pay for their gas to check their check lines, and so you'll still see some of these, like you said, romanticizing the idea of, I'm still going out there, I'm not making any money, I get 10 muskrats and it doesn't really pay for anything, but I'm just doing it because I love to do it, and I've been doing it since a kid. And I think this definitely has to be a change in the way we think. There's this idea that I hope that we're all evolving, and I mean, just the basic science on trapping doesn't really hold up. So you have this science and morality on one side versus tradition. And what ended up happening for some of these luxury brands, which was very much based on heritage and tradition of why the Chanels, the Guccis, I mean, they've been around for decades. And what ended up having to happen was we redefined what the word luxury meant. And that used to be tradition, and now it's social, responsible, and innovation. And I think that's something's going to have to happen with the way we romanticize trapping and things like that, where something's going to have to change in the way that we explain it. I mean, I hope the science will always win out, but it's not really that way a lot of the times. But something's going to happen, or it's just going to disappear, and you're going to write about it in the history books, so you're going to read about it in the history books. And I kind of feel like that's the way a lot of this is going as well. Like, trappers here in the United States, I mean, sure, in certain cities can be going strong, specifically with bobcats and coyotes because of Canada Goose. But when those prices drop, and I feel that they'll just disappear, and it'll be romanticized in history books. So that's, I guess, I'm all around optimistic. If you haven't gotten that clear.
Well, I agree. I mean, we're seeing a steady decline. If you look at the number of trapping licenses alone, if you look at the number of animals trapped, it's all been declining for the last 30 years. And as I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I hope there is a level of science and morality playing a role in those decisions for individuals. But I do agree there's a certain element of it. It's getting more expensive to load up your ATV or your pickup truck with, sorry, there are two birds fighting right outside my window, and I may have ADD.
Go break it up.
No, okay, they moved on. It was just a little scat. Yeah, so it's getting more expensive to go out and check the traps. The value of the pelts has declined, and generally speaking, it's not as acceptable in society. People say, like, really, you like to go out and set a trap to catch an animal and then kill them and then skin them. I mean, if you just say it out loud in that way, even, it sounds kind of weird. And I think, yeah, we're just generally evolving as a society. I do want to talk about Canada Goose. This is the one we deal with the most. They are based in Canada, even though they're now owned by an American hedge fund. They don't like talking about that part when they're talking about how traditional they are. And there's so much to talk about with Canada Goose, but you'd mentioned that, they may be looking to evolve, and we know that they are now selling their parkas without coyote fur trim. You can still buy the coyote fur trim, but they've got versions without it, which is interesting. And there was a rumor that picked up steam, but I tried to debunk to a degree that they were going to have a faux fur. I don't know if you saw the news on that hitting.
I did, and I see where it's coming from, and I quickly dismissed it.
I did the follow-up work and contacted everyone at Canada Goose, and I called the head office, I called the flagship store, I called customer service. I spoke with 2 or 3 people, all of whom dismissed it. And then I'd reached out to the corporate structure, who, of course, their model of communication is to not communicate at all. I think they've been doing that steadily now for 5 years. Because at first for a while they were responding to advocacy issues, and then they just stopped. And I think their model, my interpretation of their model is, as long as we're making money, you can do what you want to do. But how do you see, how do we tackle one of the largest, or at the very least most visible users of coyote fur?
Well, first off, I think some of that, these fur sales bans are going to help with that. The other is, it is a conversation. So you mentioned faux fur, and I don't think, knowing what I know about Canada Goose, there is going to be just a switch to a acrylic-based faux fur. Maybe there will be, but
I agree with you.
What they've prided themselves on, I don't see it.
Yeah, it would be a total reversal in character of who the company sets themselves up to be.
Yeah. So what's happening now with all these companies going for free in potentially cities is there is now money being pumped into who's going to be, again, another race amongst brands, who's going to have that first really sustainable, even plant-based to an extent, faux fur option. And so Stella McCartney, I think, did something with corn this last year. There's other sort of textiles that are popping up every now and then that have kind of the look and the feel of fur. And I think now that there's so much money going into it, that there is going to potentially be a very sustainable alternative to fur. And I think that would be more appealing to a Canada Goose, where they can say, well, this is the most sustainable faux option out there that's not plastic. And I could see them making that switch. There's also, I don't know if you've been following, like the lab grown meat or the cultured meat that's happening. Well, the same is happening with leather. There's a company called Modern Meadow that's growing actual leather in labs. Every fashion brand out there is just waiting for it just to pounce on it when it's ready. There's several other companies that are Bolt in San Francisco is doing the same. And I've already heard from scientists that say that they don't think it's too far off. I mean, when I say too far off, I'm thinking like a decade, where we're going to be able to grow hair out of that leather.
Wow.
And so I don't know if Canada Goose is going to be around then. I don't think if they don't switch up their fur policy in the next 5 years that they're going to be around. But I think that could be potentially, if you want real luxury fur, you can have real hair with real skin, and it won't have to hurt an animal for it. So I think alternatives are going to play a thing, because we're seeing that in every industry out there. Like one of the best examples is just like, there's probably Henry Ford did more for animals than anybody else. And the idea wasn't to help animals. He just put a car on the road and all horses pretty much were obsolete. And so I think what's going to be the great innovation that's going to make the fur industry obsolete And it wouldn't be shocking to me in the near future to see the fur industry starting to look into some of those, same way that like Tyson and Smithfield, some of these big meat companies see the writing on the wall and they're saying, well, let's start looking into some of this lab grown or cultured beef and chicken, and because this is what has to happen, for not just for the environmental reasons, but just this shift in what consumers care about. And they're like, right now, some are fighting it, some are accepting it, and I think it's just sooner or later everyone's going to be accepting it, and the same is going to happen with fur as well. So how Canada Goose does it, I don't know, and how quickly they do it, but I think they will be changing. And you said the American Investment Company. I mean, I think it's a good point to contact Bain Capital about these issues. I'm sure this is, I mean, they own majority of the stake of Canada Goose. Canada Goose has come out very openly, or has come out and said, well, we're not going to have that conversation, but maybe Bain Capital will. I'm sure that they haven't had to deal with animal activists before, so might be interesting.
That is a very interesting tact, and something we're going to have to talk about later, I think. But yeah, it is interesting looking at some of those evolutions. And I know Joshua Katcher, who I'm sure you know, is always posting stuff about some of those leather alternatives and whatnot, which it kind of boggles my mind. But I successfully purchased one piece of stock in Beyond Meat, so I feel like I've contributed.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a hard stock to get.
Yeah, I think I've made 25 cents in the last 2 days. So I'm on my way, man. I'm on my way. But yeah, Canada Goose is it's something of an enigma because their marketing strategy at this point very much seems to be, we're right, period. Mm-hmm. And they don't enter into conversation. They don't debate. They put out their stuff. Folks like you and I break it down and offer analysis of it. But it's a very unusual situation, though. As I said, I think it's very telling that they are now offering products without fur trim, and I think that's a sign that they're trying to expand without saying anything. But one of the things they say, and you've touched on, is talking about the degradation of plastics or polyurethane. No, I said that wrong. Poly something.
Polyurethane.
It's something like that.
Yeah.
We'll just presume I was correct because it is my show. I don't know. Yes. But anyway, but one of the things I've seen, so they talk a lot about that, about the, how it's unsustainable to be using plastics. And I know a lot of the fur farmers and fur trappers in Canada, they do little stunts, like they'll bury a piece of fur, untreated, of course, and a piece of faux fur, which is a very cheap plastic version, and then in 6 months reveal it and say, look, the plastic hasn't changed, but the real fur is broken down. Which, of course, they treat that stuff so heavily that it doesn't break down. That's the point. But it is a very serious issue, though. If people are looking, if they do like the look and feel and texture of fur on clothing, if designers want to work with it, I think that's a very important thing to acknowledge. That oftentimes we in advocacy avoid, is that the alternative right now is typically plastics, and that's not sustainable. That's not good for the environment. How can we, as consumers, support those changes, though, leading towards this innovation and the excitement of it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I haven't heard of that tactic of burying the faux fur and real fur. That's quite amusing, especially that it's untreated, because I've heard of some of the lakes and that have been ruined by some of these fur farms up in, was it
Nova Scotia?
Nova Scotia. I mean, it's quite a gruesome process of raising a bunch of thousands of animals in one central location, where the urine and feces goes into the water and in the soil. And then, I mean, every fashion brand that does a sustainability report, the tanning process is by far the most impactful. There's another thing I want to point out is really one of the difficult things for the faux fur fashion industry has been that they are not the biggest buyer of faux fur. And so when it comes to these huge companies that have been around for a long time that have created the plush materials, their like major market is plush toys, stuffed animals. And so when the fashion industry is coming, like, we want all this environmental reports and for you to do better and better, and they're kind of saying we don't have to because you don't buy. Like, it's until the stuffed animal people come out in revolution and say we want better stuffed animals, then you'll see faux fur get environmentally sound very quickly.
That's a terrifying thought, though, isn't it?
Yeah, we pick and choose our arguments, and the fur industry is putting it out there right now that faux fur is horrible and the microplastics in the ocean, not even realizing I mean, I've never heard of anyone kind of repeatedly washing their fur trimmed jacket, or faux fur trimmed jacket, be it. So that's a whole other side of it. But I think the conversation is happening where, we're moving away from plastic bags and plastic everything. And the demand is there. And I think it's reaching the manufacturers, it's reaching the brands. And I think as long as that tends to be at the forefront of what people care about, the fur industry really, or the faux fur industry, is really just a little behind, to be honest with you. They just came out with the first faux fur made with plastic bottles. But this change is happening so fast that I'm going to guess, I've heard from some of the brands that they say about 2 years and you're going to have a sustainable faux fur. It's all following this quick change that's happened. Only, I mean, if you look again, if I had a timeline of where the fur-free policies have started, we're looking at 2006, end of 2016, end of 2017. That's where this shift has happened. And it's going to take a little bit of time for the faux fur industry to catch up, but it's going to happen very quickly. So the change is happening, and it's driven by consumers that care about these issues. And that goes for environmental, animal welfare, human rights, I mean, all of the above.
I've got two questions I want to ask you to wrap up. One of them is about self-care and so on. This is something that I see a lot on social media, and I'm not sure if you ever need to, if you are involved with social media or if you manage any channels for HSUS. But when we post about one of your victories, when we post about one of the European nations saying we're going to, in 4 years, end fur farming, it's always, and I grew up in a home where corporate structures were talked about regularly. And I recognize, and you touched on this as well, talking about those convoluted supply chains that you can't pull the plug all the time. And particularly with some of the larger companies or with a nation, if they were to do that, it would put such a financial burden on them that it wouldn't be sustainable, because they'd have to cancel contracts and they'd have to cancel a lot of other things. And in business, there's always cancellation fees. There's always that loophole so someone makes money. So you're sitting here and you're talking with these companies and you're making the change. And as we've discussed for the last 40 minutes, change takes time sometimes. In the interim, one of the things I see a lot of when we post about this is people saying it's not fast enough, that suffering is still happening, and it is. And that's a very fair thing to point out. But I think it's also important to talk about, for someone like yourself, and I try and talk very openly about my self-care, my mental health, working in this field. How do you manage personally sort of the recognition that you're working towards this goal and you're doing so well? It's so impressive, and it's so good for all the animals and all the people of the planet, and we all appreciate that. But it is a slow change, and suffering will continue while you're in this fight. How do you reconcile that for yourself at the end of the day? Do you have just activities you do that bring you down and level you out? Or do you have a conversation with yourself or someone else about what this all means? What does self-care in that regard look like for you in terms of making what you do sustainable?
Sure. Well, I have actually a therapy appointment right after this, so there's one.
I had mine earlier in the week, so.
So I was born vegetarian. I went vegan like 15 years ago. Being born vegetarian and trying to like learn why I care about these issues more than just that's what mom made for dinner.
Yeah.
Was a process. But the thing that has kind of switched for me is the business side of this. I hate to say it, but I've cut myself off of the emotional side where I just see this as a business and I want these companies to do well. And I believe so much in what I preach that to do well, you have to do good. And so I that's the way I view all of this. I don't necessarily look at the skinning footages anymore. I know what the supply chains look like. But I guess that's my best answer is I'm so entrenched in the business side of this argument, that the morality and the cruelty, is always going to be the number one issue. It's the number one thing that's going to change people. It's the number one thing that's going to change, like people's minds. But for me, if I'm just driving home this message that this change is happening no matter what, and either you're going to be left behind or you're going to be a leader, it so far has been helpful in at least changing the way that the fur trend is going at this point. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does.
Okay.
It does very well. And that's, for me, I compartmentalize. I learned how to do that as a journalist and a crime reporter. And my attitude has been, my job is to tell stories. That's still what I do. And in order to tell these stories, I need to be able to sit with whatever's going on and observe and analyze and research and talk and do all of the things. And later, I will deal with the emotional impact of that. And I do. And that's just, I go to therapy. I do improv. I watch a lot of comedy. I spend time with friends. Those are my little self-care things. But I absolutely understand what you're saying. And I think it's hard for those who don't do this every single day of their life, in the way that we have to, where it's not just, are you successful, but you have to show in a almost a business sense, what have we accomplished? I have to deliver on measurables. I have to tell the stories. I have to, there's a job to be done. So it's sort of, you learn to filter it to a degree. But I don't want to end on that note. I want to end on what you think, the one thing, you've got an audience listening to you right now. What's the one thing that HSUS needs people to do to help in this battle? In whatever way it is, whether it's a particular petition, if it's donating to organizations, if it's getting in the street, if it's making purchase power decisions, what to you is the penultimate thing people can do to be part of the solution and one of the leaders, as you've said?
Well, thank you for this entire conversation. It's really been, that last question, I don't think I've ever been asked before, so I appreciate that. I don't know if I think about it enough. That we'll leave that for therapy later. But the number one thing, besides the obvious of not buying fur, is I really think the social media thing is quite crucial, because I know the companies care about that. When a company goes for free and you go to their comment section on their Facebook page or Instagram and you just see hundreds of thank yous, that's not something they get every day. It's something they get very, very rarely, because it's mostly people criticizing on different social media. So if you are somebody that works for a company and you do social media and you wake up and you see your comment section and it's just thank you, you're great, you're wonderful, that's going to not just confirm that they did the right thing, but it's also going to lead to additional policies. And that's what, I think fur is a starting off point, because it's the most in your face. It's the one that I think the majority of people are against. But there's a lot of things that we need to change about the fashion industry. And the more that they see that positive promotion with some of these policies can eventually lead to additional policies, I think is really, really important. And something that a lot of people don't think about as well is fashion industry is constantly moving in different employees. So like somebody can be work in social media for one fashion company, and then they immediately go to work in sustainability for another company. Mm-hmm. And what they're going to do is they're going to bring that messaging along, and they're going to remember, oh, we went for free. Let's get that positive promotion because it was great for our company, great for our social media. We got an X amount of followers that day. And so I think the wave that happens after that is just great. So, I mean, ask companies if they're for free or not. And I do know that retailers do kind of track those things. And if they aren't, then say, well, it'd be really great if you did. And if they are, then you say thank you. So I think it's pretty simple. Share on social media and we'll get there.
If you want to hear more about what PJ has been up to, check out the Humane Society of the United States on social media or visit humanesociety.org. And now, the news. Beginning in June, the Fur Bears and Defender Radio will be launching youngdefenders.ca, a website and podcast specifically made for people aged 16 and under who want to learn more about how to help protect wildlife and the environment. I'm going to be releasing a special podcast and blog shortly to give you more details. But the gist is that I've heard from a number of young people and their families about how they'd love a youth-focused podcast on these subjects. It'll be set up a little bit differently than Defender Radio in that there's a standalone website and the interviews won't be quite as long. You'll also be hearing from many voices in addition to my own. I'm also going to be looking to all of you to help build the community for this new exciting project. So, stay up to date on what's happening by signing up to get email alerts at youngdefenders.ca. And you can start following Young Defenders on social media. Just search for the name and look for the shield. The existing Defender Radio Patreon will be extended to incorporate Young Defenders, and that means a Discord chat coming soon too. Get more details at patreon.com/defenderradio. I'm really excited for this, and one of the things that makes me so excited is that I'm hoping this community will help generate content for the show. I really hope that young people will help educate other young people. As I said, there's going to be more information in coming weeks, so please do follow us on social media and head to the website youngdefenders.ca to sign up for email alerts so you can find out how you can help defend the future of wildlife and the environment through education, communication, and kindness. And until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bears, reminding you to be kind and stay informed and stay strong.